the actual explanation of man's life lies in just the fact that he is essentially spiritual and eternal, and that this world and the life that we know intellectually is, so to speak, but a cross-section of the full truth concerning him, and a cross-section of anything from a machine to a horse never can furnish even a partial explanation of the whole. Glimpsing one tiny corner of the universe, and that with only half-opened eyes, and working from an exclusively anthropocentric and geocentric point of view, men built up absurd and very horrible fables about a limited and man-like God who conducted his universe very much as a rather ignorant and barbarous prince might conduct the affairs of a small oriental kingdom. All sorts of human weaknesses, such as vanity, fickleness, and spite, were attributed to this being. Then a far-fetched and very inconsistent legend was built up concerning original sin, vicarious blood atonement, infinite punishment for finite transgressions, and in certain cases an unutterably horrible doctrine of a predestination to eternal torment or eternal bliss was added. Now, no such theory as this is taught in the Bible. If it were the object of the Bible to teach it, it would be clearly stated in a straightforward manner in some chapter or other. But it is not. The plan of salvation, which figured so prominently in the evangelical sermons and divinity books of a past generation, is as completely unknown to the Bible as it is to the Quran. There never was any such arrangement in the universe, and the Bible does not teach it at all. What happened is that certain obscure texts from Genesis, a few phrases taken here and there from Paul's letters, and one or two isolated verses from other parts of the Scriptures have been taken out and pieced together by divines to produce the kind of teaching which it seemed to them ought to have been found in the Bible. Jesus knows nothing of all this. He is indeed anything but a Pollyanna, as they say, or a cheap optimist. He warns us, not once, but often, that obstinacy in sin can bring very, very severe punishment in its train, and that a man who parts with the integrity of his soul, even though he gained the whole world, is a tragic fool. But he teaches that we are only punished for and actually punished by our own mistakes. And he teaches that every man or woman, no matter how steeped in evil and uncleanliness, has always direct access to an all-loving, all-powerful Father God, who will forgive him and supply his own strength to him to enable him to find himself again, and unto 70 times 7 if need be. Jesus has been sadly misunderstood and misrepresented in other directions too. For instance, there is no warrant whatsoever in his teaching for the setting up of any form of ecclesiasticism, of any hierarchy of officials or system or ritual. He did not authorize any such thing, and in fact, the whole tone of his mentality is definitely anti-ecclesiastical. All through his public life, he was at war with the ecclesiastics and other religious officials of his own country. They first hindered and then persecuted him with a perfectly sound instinct of self-preservation. They felt instinctively that the truth, as he taught it, was the beginning of the end for them, and they finally had him put to death. Their pretensions to authority as the representatives of God he ignored completely. And for the ritual and their ceremonies, he evinced only impatience and contempt. It seems that human nature is very prone to believe what it wants to believe, or rather to incur the labor of really searching the Scriptures with an open mind. Perfectly sincere men, for example, have appointed themselves Christian leaders with the most imposing and pretentious titles, and then clothe themselves in elaborate and gorgeous vestments, the better to impress the people. in spite of the fact that their master, in the plainest language, strictly charged his followers that they must do nothing of the kind. But be ye not called rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and all ye are brethren. Matthew 23:8. And he denounced the Pharisees as hypocrites because they love the chief seats and bind heavy burdens, grievous to be borne, with all sorts of rules and regulations. Jesus, as we shall discover later on, made a special point of discouraging the laying of emphasis upon outer observances, and indeed upon hard and fast rules and regulations of every kind. What he insisted upon was a certain spirit in one's conduct, and he was careful to teach principles only, knowing that when the spirit is right, details will take care of themselves, and that, in fact, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life, as was so obviously seen in the sad example of the Pharisees. Yet, in spite of this, the history of Orthodox Christianity is largely made up of attempts to enforce all sorts of external observances upon the people. A striking case and illustration of this is the Puritan attempt to enforce Old Testament Sabbath upon Christians. Although the Sabbath law was purely Hebrew ordinance, and the ferocious penalties involved in neglecting it applied exclusively to the desecration of Saturday. And in spite of the fact that Jesus particularly discouraged superstitious Sabbath observance, saying that Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, and making a point of doing anything that he wanted to do upon that day. He clearly indicates through his teachings that the time has come when man must make each and every day a spiritual Sabbath, by knowing and doing all things in a spiritual light. It is obvious that even if the Hebrew Sabbath were binding upon Christians, then since they do not observe it in keeping Sunday, then they will still incur all the consequences of Sabbath breaking. Many modern Christians do, however, realize that there is no system of theology in the Bible unless one likes to put it there deliberately. And they have practically given up theology altogether. But they still cling to Christianity because they feel intuitively that it is the truth. There is really no logical justification for their attitude, since they do not possess the spiritual key, which alone makes the teaching of Jesus intelligible. And so they endeavor to rationalize their attitude in various ways. This is the dilemma of the man who has neither the blind faith of orthodoxy nor the spiritual interpretation of scientific Christianity to support him. He has not a leg to stand on that does not belong to the old-fashioned Unitarian. If he does not reject miracles altogether, he is at least very uneasy about them. They embarrass him, and he wishes they were not in the Bible at all, and would be glad in his heart to be well rid of them. A Life of Jesus recently published by a well-known clergyman clearly illustrates how false this position is. In this book, he concedes that Jesus may have healed some people or helped them to heal themselves, but he draws the line there. He explains away into nothingness all the other miracles. They were the usual fantastic legends that center about all great historical figures, he thinks. On the lake, for instance, the thought of Jesus and the thought of him calmed their fears. This was the third tale that he had come to them in person, walking upon the water. Another time, it appears, he reformed a sinner, raising him out of a grave of sin, and this was expanded years and years afterwards into a ridiculous legend that he had really revived a dead man. Again, Jesus prayed fervently one night so that he looked almost radiantly happy, and Peter, who had fallen asleep, woke up with a start. And years afterward, he told some confused story about believing that he saw Moses there. So much for the transfiguration, and so forth, and so forth. Now, one must extend every sympathy to the special pleadings of a man enthralled by the beauty and mystery of the gospel, but who, in the absence of the spiritual key, seems to find his common sense and all the scientific knowledge of mankind flouted by much that these Gospels contain. But this simply will not do. If the miracles did not happen, the rest of the Gospel story loses all real significance. If Jesus did not believe them to be possible and undertake to perform them, never, it is true, for the sake of display, but still constantly and repeatedly, if he did not believe and teach many things in flat contradiction to 18th and 19th century rationalistic philosophy, then the gospel message is chaotic, contradictory, and devoid of all significance. We cannot ride away from the dilemma by saying that Jesus was not interested in the current beliefs and superstitions of his time, that he took them more or less for granted passively, because what really interested him was character. This is a feeble argument because character must include both an intelligent and vital all-around reaction to life. Character must include some definite beliefs and convictions concerning things that really matter. But the miracles did happen. All the deeds related of Jesus in the four Gospels did happen, and many others too. The which, if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Jesus himself justified what people thought to be a strange and wonderful teaching by the works he was able to do. And he went further and said, referring to those who study and practice his teachings, the works that I do, ye shall do, and greater works. Now, what after all is a miracle? Those who deny the possibility of miracles on the ground that the universe is a perfect system of law and order, to the operation of which there can be no exceptions, are perfectly right. But the explanation is that the world of which we are normally aware and with whose laws alone most people are acquainted is only a fragment of the whole universe as it really is, and that there is such a thing as appealing from a lower to a higher law, from a lesser to a greater expression. Now, the appeal from the lower to the higher law is not really a breach of law, for the possibility of such an appeal is part of the major constitution of the universe, and therefore, in the sense of a real breach of law, miracles are impossible. Yet, in the sense that all the ordinary rules of limitations of the physical plane can be set aside or overridden by an understanding which has risen above them, miracles, in the colloquial sense of the word, can and do happen. Let us suppose, for the sake of example, that on a certain Monday your affairs are in such a condition that, humanly speaking, certain consequences are sure to follow before the end of the week. These may be legal consequences, perhaps of a very unpleasant nature, following upon some decision of the courts, or they may be certain physical consequences in the human body. A competent physician may decide that a perilous operation will be absolutely necessary, or he may even feel it is his duty to say that there is no chance for the recovery of the patient. Now, if someone can raise his consciousness above the limitations of the physical plane in connection with the matter, and that is only a scientific description of what is commonly called prayer, then the conditions on the plane will change, and in some utterly unforeseen and normally impossible manner, the legal tragedy will melt away, and to the advantage, be it noted, of all parties to the case. Or the patient will be healed, instead of having to undergo the operation, or of having to die. In other words, miracles in the popular sense of the word can and do happen as the result of prayer. Prayer does change things. Prayer does make things happen quite otherwise than they would have happened had the prayer not been made. It makes no difference at all what sort of difficulty you may be in. It does not matter what the cause may have been that led up to it. Enough prayer will get you out of your difficulty if only you will be persistent enough in your appeal to God. Prayer, however, is both a science and an art. And it was to the teaching of this science and this art that Jesus devoted the greater part of his ministry. The gospel miracles happened because Jesus had this spiritual understanding that gave him greater power in prayer than anyone else before or since. One other attempt to interpret the Gospels must be taken into consideration. Tolstoy endeavored to put forward the Sermon on the Mount as a practical guide to life, taking its precepts literally at their face value and ignoring the spiritual interpretation of which he was unaware, and excluding the plane of spirit in which he did not believe, discarding the whole of the Bible except the 4 Gospels, and discounting all miracles. He made a heroic but futile attempt to combine Christianity and materialism, and of course he failed. His real place in history turns out to be not that of the founder of a new religious movement, but that of the man whose practical anarchism, promulgated with all the fire of genius, paved the way for the Bolshevik Revolution, even as Rousseau had cleared the road for the French Revolution. It is the spiritual key that unlocks the mystery of the Bible teaching in general, and one of the Gospels in particular. It is a spiritual key that explains the miracles and shows that they were performed in order to prove to us that we too can perform miracles and thereby overcome sin, sickness, and limitation. With this key, we can afford to discard verbal inspiration and all superstitious literalism, and yet understand that the Bible really is the most precious and most authentic of all man's possessions. Externally, the Bible is a collection of inspired documents written by men of all kinds in all sorts of circumstances and over hundreds of years of time. The documents, as we have them, are seldom originals, but redactions and compilations of older fragments, and the names of the actual writers are seldom known for certain. This, however, does not affect the spiritual purpose of the Bible in the slightest degree. It is, in fact, quite immaterial. The book, as we have it, is an inexhaustible reservoir of spiritual truth, compiled under divine inspiration, and the actual route by which it reached its present form does not matter. The name of the writer of any particular chapter is really of no more importance than would be the name of his amanuensis, if he employed one. Divine wisdom is the author, and that is all that concerns us. What is called the higher criticism concerns itself exclusively with externals, completely missing the spiritual content of the scriptures, and from the spiritual point of view is of no importance. History, biography, lyrical, and other poetic forms are various mediums through which the spiritual message is given in the Bible. Then above all, the parable is used to convey spiritual and metaphysical